6 years ago, my life imploded. My husband, Mark, after a bizarre drunken confession from our mutual friend Dan professing his love for me, suddenly demanded a paternity test for our newborn son. I was devastated by his lack of trust and refused, leading to our swift divorce where he terminated his parental rights. I rebuilt my life as a single mom in Austin, Texas, only for Mark to reappear, revealing a sickening truth: my own mother had conspired with Dan, a wealthy, entitled manchild I barely tolerated, to destroy my marriage. She fed Mark lies about an affair, all for a promised $30,000 payout from Dan. This isn't just a story of a failed marriage. It's a chilling account of maternal narcissism, financial manipulation, and the ultimate betrayal by a parent. Witness the shocking unraveling of a mother's deceit, her attempts at gaslighting, and my agonizing journey to process this unthinkable treachery. If you've ever dealt with a toxic parent, a manipulative ex, or a betrayal that cut to the core, this story of complex trauma and the fight for truth will resonate deeply. The Texas sun usually felt like a warm embrace, but for the past 6 years it had often seemed to mock the cold knot of confusion and betrayal that had settled deep within me. I'm Sarah, 29 now, a marketing executive in Austin, and a single mom to my amazing 6.5-year-old son, Leo Doe. 6 years ago, my life, as I knew it, shattered into a million irreparable pieces, all because of a demand I never saw coming, from a man I thought I knew, orchestrated by someone I should have been able to trust above all others. My ex-husband, Mark, who's now 30, and I were college sweethearts. We went to different universities in Texas, me at UT Austin, him at A&M, but a mutual friend, a guy named Dan, not his real name but close enough, set us up. Dan was a character. Charming on the surface, but with an undercurrent of entitlement that always made me vaguely uncomfortable. He was a trust fund kid, used to getting his way, but he was also a link to Mark, so I tolerated him. Mark and I dated for 2 wonderful years, and a year and a half after graduation we were married. He was, I thought, perfect, kind, funny, supportive, my rock. Having Leo shortly after felt like the natural, joyful next step. We were ticking off all the quintessential life goals: new house in a quiet South Austin neighborhood a month after Leo was born, a future stretching out before us, bright and full of promise. Then came the housewarming party, and Dan, who had always harbored a not-so-secret crush on me, one I'd always politely but firmly rebuffed, got blackout drunk. He cornered me in the kitchen, his words slurring, and confessed his undying love. He even suggested we elope, that he'd happily adopt Leo, that he wanted to be with me at any cost. I was beyond disgusted, repulsed by his drunken, inappropriate declaration. I immediately told Mark, who was equally appalled, and we promptly had Dan kicked out of our new home. I thought that was the end of it, a bizarre, unpleasant blip. I was so wrong. After that night, Mark changed. He became distant, withdrawn, a shadow of the loving, engaged husband and father he'd been. Late nights at the office became the norm. He'd come home at odd hours, reeking of a fatigue that seemed more emotional than physical, as if he were deliberately trying to spend as little time at home as possible. Even more heartbreaking, he started keeping his distance from Leo. Our beautiful, giggling baby boy, who he had adored, was now met with a strange, almost pained, detachment. The emotional abandonment was a knife to my heart. Nearly a week after the party, I finally confronted him. He initially insisted everything was fine, just stress from his new promotion. But then, the dam broke. He brought up Dan's drunken confession. He admitted, his voice tight with a suspicion that felt like a betrayal in itself, that he was finding it hard to believe Dan and I hadn't had a thing in the past, given how close we'd supposedly been in college. The truth? Dan and I were part of the same larger friend group, friendly acquaintances at best. We'd never been close in the way Mark was implying. I was deeply offended, hurt beyond words that he could even imply I'd been unfaithful, that I'd lied to him about something so fundamental. I think it was the pregnancy hormones still raging, the exhaustion of new motherhood, the sheer injustice of his accusation, but I lashed out. I yelled, I cried, I demanded to know how he could doubt me, doubt us, after everything we'd shared. The argument escalated, a torrent of hurt feelings and misunderstandings. And then he dropped the bombshell. He demanded a paternity test for Leo, to make sure Leo was his. Under normal circumstances, a paternity test isn't something to shy away from if there are genuine doubts. I had nothing to hide. Leo was unequivocally Mark's son, but this wasn't about genuine doubt. This was an accusation, a vile, baseless accusation of infidelity from the man I loved, the father of my child. What more proof of loyalty did he need than our son, our shared life, our vows? The implication, the sheer disrespect, was a wound too deep to ignore. If he couldn't trust me, if he could believe I was capable of such a profound deception, then there was no foundation left for our marriage. I didn't want Leo to grow up in a home filled with suspicion and resentment, an unhappy marriage mirroring the ones we'd both seen in our extended families. That night, my heart shattered. I packed a bag for myself and Leo and moved in with my mother. My dad had passed away from lung cancer a few years before Leo was born, and Mom lived alone in her small house in Hyde Park. I figured she'd appreciate the company, and I desperately needed her support. She was, as always, wonderful, told me I was doing the right thing, that she was proud of me for standing up for myself, and was incredibly supportive of my decision. The codependent part of me had worried she'd judge me for a failed marriage, but she was nothing but loving. The next day I filed for divorce and full custody of Leo. Mark, to my surprise, didn't contest either. Within 6 months he had even terminated his parental rights. The divorce was finalized, and just like that he was gone from our lives. I received a $770,000 settlement, his share of the equity in our house, which was mostly paid for by a generous wedding gift from his parents, and some savings, enough to start a new life, a better one, for me and my son. The first few years were a blur. I resumed working a few weeks after the divorce, my maternity leave cut short by necessity. Juggling a demanding job, single motherhood, and the crushing guilt of depriving Leo of a father was insane, but I powered through. I stayed at Mom's for a couple of months then. Despite her protests that I was welcome to stay as long as I needed, I found my own apartment. I craved independence, and I didn't want to burden her. I hired a wonderful full-time nanny, Mrs. Rodriguez, who became like a second grandmother to Leo. Fast forward 6 years, I'm now living in a much larger apartment in a great school district, thriving in a senior position at the same marketing firm, earning a fantastic paycheck. Leo has everything he could ever ask for, and I'm immensely proud that I can provide for him so well. I've moved on from my failed marriage, dated a bit, had a few casual flings, but nothing serious. Despite Mom's gentle nudges to find a new husband, I haven't been interested. My focus is Leo. It's just me and my boy, and I assumed that's how it would be until I felt truly ready for something more. Then, a few days ago, the past came knocking. Literally, my ex-husband Mark showed up at my door, unannounced, after 6 years of complete silence. Friends had told me he'd moved to Australia a few months after our divorce. That was the last I'd heard of him. His sudden reappearance was a profound shock. I didn't even know how he'd found my new address. My first instinct was to slam the door in his face. But after overcoming the initial shock, I told him, my voice colder than I intended, that I wasn't willing to speak to him, that he needed to leave. He looked different, older, worn, a haunted look in his eyes. He said he understood that he would leave, but first he needed to apologize, to explain his side of what happened all those years ago. He looked so broken, so desperate, that a flicker of curiosity, a long-dormant need for answers, stirred within me. I agreed to talk, but not at my home, not with Leo around, especially since it was the weekend. We arranged to meet at a nearby coffee shop, Epoch Coffee, the following day. Yesterday he finally told me, and boy am I in a situation. He started by apologizing profusely for his doubt, for his demand for the paternity test, for abandoning me and Leo. He'd made a huge, unforgivable mistake, he said. And then he dropped the bombshell that turned my world upside down all over again. My mother, my own mother, was responsible for our divorce. Apparently, hours after I told Mark about Dan's drunken confession at the housewarming party, after Mark had kicked Dan out, my mother had reached out to Mark. She had fed him a poisonous stream of lies. She told him that Dan and I had been an item in college, a serious one. She told him she suspected I'd been having an affair with Dan even after marrying Mark. She suggested that Dan's confession was actually him trying to force my hand, that I was scared of breaking things off with Mark and had to resort to throwing Dan under the bus to get rid of him. My mother, the woman who had comforted me, supported my decision to leave Mark, had been the one to plant the seeds of doubt, to water them with her insidious lies, to make Mark question my loyalty, my love, our son's very paternity. The betrayal was so profound, so unthinkable, it felt like a physical blow. Mark, already reeling from Dan's public declaration and my subsequent hormonally fueled, I admit, outburst when he'd questioned me, had been vulnerable. My mother's words, coming from someone he trusted, someone who was my mother, had tipped him over the edge. His refusal to agree to the paternity test, he now understood, had felt like an admission of guilt to him. He hadn't been able to take it, he'd left. But why would Dan suddenly choose to reveal this now after 6 years? And why would my mother do such a monstrous thing? Mark explained. A few weeks ago, Dan, consumed by guilt, and as I later found out from mutual friends, now a bitter, twice-divorced alcoholic, had reached out to Mark on social media. He'd sent Mark screenshots of his text exchanges with my mother from all those years ago, exchanges leading up to that fateful housewarming party. My mother had promised Dan she would clear the way for him, that she'd ensure I wouldn't be married to Mark for much longer. In return for her services, Dan, the trust fund baby, had promised to pay my mother $30,000. It was horrifying, sickening, but it also, in a twisted way, made a terrifying amount of sense. I knew my mother always signed her texts with an E, her first initial. The screenshots Mark showed me, airdropped to my phone right there in the coffee shop, all bore that damning E. It was undeniably her. And Dan offering her money, that also tracked. He was used to buying his way through life. The more I thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces clicked into place. My mother's uncharacteristic happiness when I told her I was divorcing Mark, her almost too enthusiastic support. Her conservative views on marriage suddenly taking a back seat. Her subtle, persistent attempts to talk about Dan, about what a poor guy he was, how he deserved another chance to make things right with me. Attempts I'd always shut down because, frankly, I found Dan repulsive. He was fun in small doses in college, but as a partner, an entitled manchild. Not my type. She'd even tried to set me up with a string of her friends' sons after my divorce, all of them corporate types with impressive paychecks but the personalities of damp cardboard. She'd always preached that money matters most. My ex-husband, Mark, had been doing well, but we were comfortable, not rich. Our first house was a modest starter home, bought with help from his parents and our combined savings. It took all four of us to swing it. We weren't wealthy, and perhaps in my mother's eyes, that was my fatal flaw. She wanted a rich husband for me, and she was willing to destroy my actual happiness to achieve her twisted vision of what my life should be. The financial abuse aspect, her willingness to trade her daughter's marriage for cash, was a particularly vile revelation. When Mark showed me those screenshots, the cold, hard evidence of my mother's treachery, I almost fainted. The shock was a physical blow. After a while, I managed to pull myself together enough to tell Mark I needed time, that I'd talk to him later. I left the coffee shop in a daze and drove straight to my mother's house. I didn't beat around the bush. As soon as she opened the door, her usual benign smile faltering at the sight of my thunderous expression, I confronted her. She tried to deny it at first, her eyes darting nervously, her hands fluttering. But I could see the guilt, the panic, in her face. Eventually, under the weight of my cold, unwavering stare, she broke down. She confessed everything. She had agreed to help Dan. She had been in dire need of money back then. After my father passed, the money he'd left her had sustained her for a while, but it was dwindling fast. She'd been a stay-at-home mom her whole life, had no recent work experience, and was struggling to find a job. She'd been too proud, too ashamed, to ask me for help, especially since I just bought a house, had a new baby, and was, as I'd often complained, feeling the financial pinch myself. So when Dan, her rich acquaintance, reached out with his sordid proposal, she'd seen it as a lifeline, a last resort. She'd intended to put in a good word for him after manipulating Mark into leaving me. But Dan, with his drunken confession, had jumped the gun. She hadn't been able to salvage the situation. She even tried to convince me, again, that she'd done it all for my own good, that Dan was well off, that I never would have had to worry about money or work if I'd ended up with him. Her gaslighting was still in full effect, even now. She claimed she'd been looking out for me, and pleaded with me not to take this to heart. I left her house that day, disgusted, horrified, my entire world, my entire understanding of my mother, irrevocably shattered. I haven't been to see her since. I haven't responded to her calls, her texts. My ex-husband, Mark, thankfully, has been sensible enough to respect my need for space. But my mother, she keeps sending texts, every single day, pleading, justifying, begging for forgiveness. I don't have the heart to block her, not yet. My emotions are a tangled, chaotic mess. Yesterday, she sent a text that hit harder than the rest. She said that no matter what she'd done, she still wished nothing but the best for me. She wanted me to understand that she was her own person, that she'd had to watch out for herself too, to survive on her own. She regretted it, she said, but it was done. She hadn't asked me for help because she knew I couldn't afford to support her and my own new family. What she did, she claimed, was out of sheer desperation. She's tried to make it up to me since, by trying to set me up with other rich men, I suppose, and would continue trying for the rest of her life. That message made me tear up, not with sympathy, but with a profound, aching sadness. I've spent my whole life with this woman, and in one day, my entire world, my entire understanding of who she was turned upside down. I feel genuinely lost. The complex trauma of this maternal betrayal is a heavy weight. I don't know how to move forward from this. For 4 agonizing days after confronting my mother, I existed in a fog of disbelief, and a pain so profound it felt like my very bones ached. Her text messages, a daily barrage of self-pitying justifications and pleas for understanding, were a constant, unwelcome reminder of her treachery. I read them, each one a fresh twist of the knife, but I didn't respond. What could I possibly say? The mother I thought I knew, the woman I had trusted implicitly, had sold my happiness, my marriage, my son's right to a father, for $30,000. The betrayal was a monstrous thing, a gaping wound in the fabric of my life. I finally confided in a few close friends, the ones who had been my rocks through the divorce and the challenging early years of single motherhood. Their reactions were a potent cocktail of shock, outrage, and unwavering support for me. Their validation, their shared horror at my mother's actions, was a lifeline in the churning sea of my emotions. They too were baffled by Dan's sudden decision to confess to Mark after 6 silent years. One friend, a journalist with a knack for digging, did some sleuthing. It turned out Dan, after 2 messy, expensive divorces and a string of failed business ventures, his trust fund apparently not as bottomless as he'd believed, was now a bitter, struggling alcoholic, living in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of Fort Worth. His life was a shambles. My friend's best guess? Dan, in his alcohol-fueled misery and perhaps consumed by a toxic brew of guilt and resentment, had decided to stir up drama, to lash out, to make others as miserable as he was. It didn't really matter why he'd done it, the damage was done. The advice I received online from anonymous but surprisingly insightful strangers was overwhelmingly supportive. They echoed my friend's sentiments. My mother's actions were indefensible. Her attempts to gaslight me into believing she'd acted in my best interest were, as one commenter put it, revolting. They urged me to protect myself, to establish firm boundaries, to prioritize my own healing and my son's well-being. And they were right. I realized, with a clarity that cut through the emotional haze, that I had been ready to believe I was somehow in the wrong, that my reaction to Mark's initial demand for a paternity test had been the catalyst for our divorce. That's how insidious her gaslighting had been over the years, a slow, steady erosion of my self-trust. But no more. After my promotion a couple of years ago, I had been the one primarily supporting my mother financially, ensuring she lived comfortably. She had been living off my money, all while harboring this monstrous secret. That realization was a final, decisive blow to any lingering filial obligation I might have felt. So I finally did it. I blocked my mother on all platforms. Everywhere. I even instructed my assistant at work to discontinue the monthly financial support I'd been providing her. A huge, suffocating weight lifted from my shoulders. I could finally breathe. It was a crazy, emotional week, but I'd made it through. My only remaining concern was Leo. How would I explain to my 6-year-old son why we wouldn't be visiting his beloved Grandma E, as he called her, on the weekends anymore? I hoped desperately that he just wouldn't bring it up, at least not for a while. The thought of putting him through more emotional turmoil after he'd already gone 6 years without a father was unbearable. My heart ached for him. He deserved a childhood free from this adult-created chaos. I could never go back to having a normal, cordial relationship with my mother, not ever. That was something I was absolutely sure of. I didn't even read her last few messages before I blocked her. I knew there was nothing she could say to make me stay. I was done for good. If she had loved me even half as much as I had loved her, we wouldn't be in this awful situation. But she chose this. She chose to keep this secret, to gaslight me, to make me believe I was somehow at fault. It was infuriating, heartbreaking, but the past was the past. I had no other option but to move on. And that's what I was choosing to do. Choosing to let go of my mother, of all the resentment, so I wouldn't have to carry it around like a toxic burden for the rest of my life. My next step was therapy. I found a highly recommended therapist in Austin specializing in complex trauma and narcissistic family systems. I knew, at this stage of my career, my life, I couldn't afford to break down, to let this spiral into depression. I needed to heal, for myself and for Leo. As for Mark, my ex-husband, that was a more complicated emotional landscape. I finally got back to him. We met again, this time at a neutral park halfway between our homes. Getting back together romantically was out of the question. My mother's interference aside, he had still abandoned me and Leo, doubted my fidelity, and terminated his parental rights. He'd been an idiot, he admitted freely, consumed by a jealousy and insecurity that my mother had expertly manipulated. But that didn't erase the hurt, the lost years. However, he practically begged me, his voice raw with a sincerity that surprised me, to let him have a shot at being a dad to Leo. He deeply regretted not being part of Leo's life, of missing those crucial first 6 years. He seemed genuinely heartbroken by his past actions, and I wanted to give him a second chance, not for my sake, certainly not out of any rekindled affection for him, but for Leo. My son often asked about his father, innocent questions that pierced my heart. Now Leo finally had a chance to have a father, a real one. They both deserved that. Obviously, there were restrictions, strict rules. Mark couldn't just reappear and expect to take over dad duties without testing the waters. For now, he's allowed to meet Leo once a week, for a couple of hours, always supervised by me. He can't take Leo out alone. We've had 2 such visits so far, at a local children's museum and a park. And surprisingly, things seem to be going well. Mark is wonderful with Leo, patient, engaging, fun. And Leo, though he doesn't yet understand exactly who this new friend of Mommy's is, clearly adores him. He just knows Mark is fun to be around. We'll phase Mark into the father role slowly, carefully, always prioritizing Leo's emotional well-being. If things continue to go well, Mark has said he'll move back to Austin permanently. He'd been living in Dallas after his brief, ill-fated stint in Australia. He hopes that, eventually, if I agree, we can co-parent Leo, perhaps with joint custody or at least regular visitation rights. I've told him not to get ahead of himself, one step at a time, but truth be told, it's nice seeing them bond. My heart aches for the lost years, but it also swells with a tentative hope for Leo's future. He deserves a father who loves him, who wants to be in his life. And Mark, despite his past failings, seems determined to be that man now. My mother? I haven't spoken to her since I blocked her. I don't know if I ever will. The betrayal was too deep, the narcissism too ingrained. She chose money and a life of manipulative ease over her own daughter's happiness, over her grandson's well-being. That's a truth I have to live with, but I also choose not to let it define me. I am building a new life, a stronger life, for myself and for my son. We have Mark, tentatively, back in our orbit. We have the unwavering support of my incredible friends, and we have each other. The journey ahead won't be easy, but for the first time in a very long time, I feel a sense of hope, a sense of peace. The healing journey is just beginning, but I'm facing it with open eyes and a heart that, though scarred, is finally slowly beginning to mend. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch.